I've been really enjoying reading this book over the last couple of weeks, preparing for this meeting. And it's 1st of May, it's International Workers' Day. This is a day of international solidarity. I think it's very apt that we're doing the meeting on this day. And, Erima acknowledged that we're on Aboriginal land at the start of the meeting, and I would just like to carry that forward a bit because, actually the struggle for Aboriginal liberation is, there's so much in this book and in Connolly's whole approach to revolutionary struggle that you can really see actually finding expression in the struggles of Aboriginal people on this continent. So, Connolly's central political thesis is that the fight for national liberation, the fight against colonial oppression, must be a working class struggle for socialism, that those two things need to be fused together. And he spent his entire life trying to fuse those two things together. And the 1st of May, 1946, we saw an amazing expression of that here in Australia, actually, where you had Aboriginal pastoral workers that were held in appalling colonial bondage on pastoral stations in the Pilbara in Western Australia, went on strike against the colonial oppression that they were suffering and mounted a strike starting on this day that covered an enormous area, actually as big as the UK in the northwest of northwest of Australia, and they did it organising along cultural lines. They held a massive cultural meeting where there were many different languages of the different Aboriginal people spoken, who came together, who planned that we're going to have a day where we're all going to go on strike together. There was a communist up there agitating by the name of Don McLeod, who brought the doctrines of socialism. There were socialist Aboriginal people that were leading that struggle, and it was an incredible struggle. They weren't allowed off a particular pastoral station at that point in time. They were bonded to a particular pastoralist. They couldn't leave. And they broke that system through strike action, and they broke that system through action with, other working class people across Australia. And so you can really see the way that working class fight, against colonialism, it's so important. And Connolly was just so ahead of his time in terms of bringing this theory into the socialist movement at this point, because in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you're at a time when it was called the Second International, was the sort of international socialist organisation where Marxists were debating out how do we try to change the world. And anti-colonial politics was not a strong feature of the Second International. It was a very weak feature of the Second International. There was a gradualist idea about what socialism would be, that it would develop out of capitalism. They had this quite, doctrinaire and mechanical interpretation of Marx, that you would have set stages of development that all people needed to pass through. And when you finally got, to capitalism, then that would ripen into socialism, which would somehow come about inevitably. Connolly stood against that, actually, and I'll just read an extract from the book that I found. In 1896, there's a passage in one of the articles called "Ireland for the Irish," where he speaks against this. He says, "Those who believe in the strange theory that the progress of the human race has been in some strange manner preordained to pass through the various stages of communism, chattel slavery, feudalism, and wage slavery as a preparation for a higher ordered society of the future, who teach that since society has walked along certain lines that might not attach altered circumstances, have reached the same high goal along totally different lines, will of course regard the Irish adherents," and this is part of his particular Irish nationalism, "regard the Irish adherents to a clan ownership at such a comparatively recent date as the 17th century as evidence of retarded economical development and therefore a hindrance to progress." So he was talking there about the fact that you had communal forms of property ownership in Ireland as late as the 17th century. He says this is happening so late, you must consider Ireland to be backward. But he argues, but the sympathetic student of history who believes in the possibility of a people by political intuition anticipating the lessons afterwards revealed to them in the sad school of experience will be more inclined to join with the ardent Irish patriot in his lavish expressions of admiration for the sagacity of his Celtic forefathers who foreshadowed in the democratic organisation of the Irish clan the more perfect organisation of the democratic society of the future. Okay, now there's contains in the seeds of this actually what we see in Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, right? Trotsky argued, forget about this idea that you have to pass through these stages. If you in the so-called backward countries, they can learn the lessons and they can engage with a capitalist system that's global, and they can grab the technology that's developed in the industrial centres, and you have socialism now. And there's the seeds of that you can see there in Connolly's writing in 1896, that the people. That these lessons have been revealed in the sad school of experience. There's no need for us to go through the horrors, that have existed elsewhere in order to lay the basis for our own sort of shift to socialism. I mean, and there's really interesting examples in Australian history, actually, of sort of Aboriginal communal forms of organisation informing a particular vision of socialism and inspiring a particular vision of socialist transformation. There's just so much there in Connolly. A big part of what he's arguing as well is that actually the struggle for the liberation of oppressed colonies is in the interests of the workers in the imperial core, and can play a very important educative role in terms of challenging their chauvinism and challenging their belief in the so-called superiority of the civilisation that we're actually part of. As part of the principles of the Irish Socialist Republican Party in the 1890s that Conor spoke about, he said the subjugation of one nation to another, as of Ireland to England, is a barrier to the free political and economic development of the subjected nations, and can only serve the interests of the exploiting classes of both nations. So it's against the interests of the Irish, but it also only serves the interests of the exploiting class in Britain as well. So the cause of Irish revolution should also be the cause of the British working class. And I think it's this really interesting and very, very sharp and very, very important differentiation that Connolly makes in the Irish situation, where most of the Republican movement doesn't have a class critique, or it certainly doesn't bring a class critique to the fore in terms of its argument about what the struggle actually needs to look like, and appeals to the idea of some kind of class unity between the Irish capitalists, the Irish landlords, and the Irish masses, that we all have some kind of interest in the Republican Revolution, rather than actually orienting to the working class. And Connolly is like quite the opposite. He is sharply critical of the Irish capitalist class, and says that the struggle has to be based on a struggle for socialism and based on the Irish working class. And he says that there's an objection that you actually get from many of the Republicans, that if we argue for socialism, we're going to put off the more powerful sections of Irish society, like the Irish capitalist class, and will somehow compromise the integrity of our struggle. And I'll just read again from the book, from another passage. I'll try to find it here. What does this objection mean? That we must conciliate the privileged classes in Ireland, but you can only disarm their hostility by assuring them that in a free Ireland, their privileges will not be interfered with. That is to say, you must guarantee that when Ireland is free of foreign domination, the green coats of an Irish army will guard the fraudulent gains of capitalist and landlord from the thin hand of the poor as effectually and remorselessly as the scarlet-coated emissaries of England do today. Right? And I think it's just not only such brilliant class politics, but such a prescient warning about actually what happens to so many national liberation movements in the 20th century, in Ireland and elsewhere. And I did just want to talk a little bit now about the importance actually of this theory about relying on the struggle and the power of the working class rather than appealing to the bourgeoisie in these colonial countries, and thinking that you can have some kind of popular front. Or this was a very, very popular theory, not only in the Second International, was for this idea of stages. Actually, Stalinist communist parties in a lot of the 20th century for a stages theory, and for subordinating the struggle of the colonial working class to make an alliance with the colonial bourgeoisie. And we can really see that this had a massive impact, on the world, and had a massive impact on the shape of anti-colonial struggles. That just to make some comments now about what that actually set up in terms of the situation we're facing with the horrific genocide in Gaza and the oppression that exists in Palestine. Because you look at what Israel's doing now, obliterating Gaza, the absolute genocide we're seeing, they are doing that with the active cooperation of the Arab regimes in the supposedly free from colonial countries. Egypt, free from British imperialism. Now Egypt is there playing an active role, actually suppressing the the blockade of Gaza would be impossible without the support of the Egyptian regime. The same is true of Jordan. The same is true of so many of the Arab regimes. And very unfortunately, where the Palestinians have got to in terms of the political situation they're at the moment, you look at 30 years ago when you had an uprising, the Intifada at the end of the 1980s and into the early 1990s that was based on the popular classes in Palestine, really connected with Arab masses, got people right across the Arab world out onto the streets. But the PLO at the time didn't have Connolly's politics, right? They had a politics that we are going to try to actually appeal to the Arab leaders as the way that we're going to be able to get some power and leverage against Israel. And so they went around and said, go home in Jordan. Go home in Tunisia, go home, where people, the Arab masses were actually out on the streets. We don't want to encourage popular struggle because we want to ally with the bourgeoisie. And when we can see where that's actually ended up in terms of the, trying to actually appeal to the Arab bourgeoisie, trying to actually negotiate with imperialism, trying to actually, the Oslo Accords, the two-state solution, is absolutely in tatters. And it's obviously the Israelis that are to blame. It's the Israelis that are carrying out the horrific, frightful massacres, but the political lessons, that were very much, the political situation was, I think, very presciently anticipated by James Connolly in so many of his writings. This book is also great, not just because of the excellent writing. I will sort of make one more point about the excellent writing. Connolly made an argument that if you're going to build a socialist Republican revolution, you can't just rely on an appeal to nationalism, can't just rely on an appeal to the idea that the Irish needed to be free. You also needed for there to be actually a material argument about how people were going to benefit, how people were actually going to be able to go forward and how they were going to be able to get those material gains. And he did that by making an argument for socialism and what socialism would mean and what it would look like. And I think, it's just brilliant writing in there about this vision for a new world. So this is from one of the articles called Irish Revolutions, Utopian and Scientific. He says, as agriculture, the staple industry of Ireland, like every other industry, is conducted really in the interests of the privileged few as a matter of private gain, and not at all in order to serve the people. And as is this false conception of property which lies at the root of Irish misery, so that change in the social system which shall abolish a society founded upon property and replace it by a society founded upon justice, which shall abolish the landlord and serf, the capitalist and the drudge, the prince and the pauper, the millionaire and the outcast, which shall relegate to the limbo of exploded superstitions all the monarchical, aristocratic and financial castes which thrive so luxuriantly upon our Irish soil, which shall make the maintenance of all its own people the first concern of statesmanship, the paramount public service and public duty. This change will be, in economics, the revolution we work for. This is socialism, right? So this is the vision we actually have to put out there, one, about that fundamental material, changes that can be there for the popular classes, for the working class, if they're going to carry on that struggle. But yeah, there's also just these really lovely personal moments in the book where you can see, like Connolly, not the political theorist, but Connolly the man, because there's all these letters that Connor's, sort of found and that are published. And there's just one I'll read, I thought comrades might relate to, he wrote to Keir Hardie, who was a, very important Labour leader in Britain in 1897. He says, as far as my personal experience, or rather my personal financial position in Dublin is concerned, well, I think that I have about reached the bottom rung of the ladder. I'm poorer than I ever was before, and I'm undergoing a gentle process of scientific, slow starvation. An agitator's lot is not a happy one. No lecture fees, no big bazaars, no enthusiastic election meetings, nothing but a constant grind, stump and grind. Nothing left but the joy of the onset, which Connor footnotes as being a reference to a song, I think, Connor. But anyway, you could maybe correct. It's sometimes there's nothing but stump and grind, comrades, when you're out there. But it's, there's no accolades, there's no, fantastic meetings. But the socialist struggle that you're building is about preparing for moments where there can be those flashes of crisis and also those flashes of brilliance. And I think that's just what I wanted to end on, is Connolly's role in the Easter Rising, which is a moment of historic brilliance, right? This is, 1916, the British Empire, the might of the British Empire worldwide. People can't think that it can be defeated, right? And there's, it's after quite a devastating moment in Connolly's own life and in the history of the Irish working class, where you've had the smashing, of a very successful lockout, actually, of the union that Connolly led, and it looked like a low point in Irish history. But there were groups of revolutionaries who said, we're going to actually have a crack at having a rising against British imperialism, and they launched the Easter Rising in 1916. And there's the line from the Foggy Dew, which, a song, which the world did gaze with deep amaze at these fearless ones but few. And it did. It sent shockwaves around the world, the fact that people would stand up to the British Empire, stand their ground, fight back. And Connolly was executed, for his participation in that rising. And people say that the rising was premature, and no doubt was premature. I mean, Lenin wrote in support of the rising and said that what happened there was brilliant and was necessary, and socialists should support it, but it was premature and didn't actually get to see what came after, which was a revolutionary wave that swept Europe, which was an anti-colonial wave that swept the world. Didn't get to actually see that. Connolly didn't get to see that vision that he had of working class fight against imperialism actually coming to life in the way that it did after World War I. But he did see that possibility of it, and that's just what I wanted to end on, is his writing at the start of the First World War about the need to turn the World War into a civil war. He wrote about that in 1914. This is something that's very important in terms of Lenin's theory of anti-imperialism, the argument. Most of the socialist movement across Europe supported the war, supported their own governments going into the First World War. Connolly was one of a very few handful of socialists that actually opposed it and called for, he said, the working classes of Europe, rather than slaughter each other for the benefit of kings and financiers, they should proceed tomorrow to erect barricades all over Europe, to break up bridges and destroy the transport service that war might be abolished. We should be perfectly justified in following such a glorious example and contributing our aid to the final dethronement of the vulture classes that rob and rule the world. And then finally, quote, he says, starting thus, Ireland may yet set the torch to a European conflagration that will not burn out until the last throne and the last capitalist bond and debenture will be shriveled on the funeral pyre of the last warlord. And they did set the torch to a European conflagration that did end the First World War and led to the Socialist Revolution. But there's a whole history of what happened to the anti-colonial movements. But I think, this incredible vision, incredible politics, and thanks so much, Connor, for bringing it all together in this book.